Medellín, Colombia, early 1993. A silver sedan idles 3 blocks from a safe house in the Los Olivos neighborhood. Inside, 2 men sit without speaking. One holds a radio. The other watches a third-floor window through the windshield. They have been waiting for 4 hours. Somewhere above them, in a room with the curtains drawn, Pablo Escobar is on the phone. He has been on the phone for too long, longer than any professional would allow. Colombian intelligence has already triangulated the signal. The clock is moving. What nobody in that silver sedan knows is that a second team, operating independently, has been feeding Escobar's position to a rival organization. One that wears suits instead of fatigues, bribes judges instead of threatening them, and has spent over a decade building a network of informants so precise it can track a man through the heat signature of a single phone call. The Cali Cartel isn't waiting for the government to finish this. They've been helping it along. So when the question is asked, who really destroyed Pablo Escobar? The answer is more complicated than any official history admits. And when Cali celebrated his death, they had no idea they had just started the countdown to their own. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the channel for stories like this one. Now rewind. To understand how 2 criminal empires ended up destroying each other, you have to go back to the geography. Colombia in the 1960s and 70s was not a narco-state waiting to happen. It was a country already fractured along lines of class, political violence, and institutional weakness that made it uniquely vulnerable to what was coming. The Andes split the country into isolated regions with poor road infrastructure and weak federal presence. Bogotá was far. The rule of law was inconsistently applied at best, and in rural areas it was often absent entirely. La Violencia, the decade-long civil conflict between liberal and conservative factions that killed an estimated 200,000 Colombians between 1948 and 1958, had left deep institutional scars and a culture of private enforcement. If the state couldn't protect you, you found someone who could. That logic didn't disappear when the formal conflict ended. It just found new business models. The first of those models was marijuana. In the 1960s and early 70s, Colombian entrepreneurs began exporting cannabis to the United States through Caribbean smuggling networks. The profit margins were significant, but the product was bulky, the roots were exposed, and the American market was changing. By the mid-1970s, cocaine was becoming the premium product, compact, high value, and in rapidly growing demand among middle-class American consumers. The shift wasn't gradual. It was a pivot that rewrote the entire structure of Colombian organized crime almost overnight. The logistics of early cocaine trafficking were handled by loose networks of Colombians who had emigrated to Miami, New York, and other American cities. They were effective but uncoordinated. The real transformation came when Colombian producers realized they could vertically integrate, controlling cultivation in Peru and Bolivia, processing in Colombia, and distribution in the United States, and capture profit at every stage of the supply chain. This was not a criminal insight, it was a business one. And the men who made that leap fastest would become the 2 most powerful criminal organizations the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. They were born in the same country, within years of each other, from similar social conditions. But from the beginning, they were different kinds of operations built by different kinds of men. And those differences would define everything that followed. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born in 1949 in Rio Negro, Antioquia, a department in the Andes whose capital, Medellín, would give the first cartel its name. He grew up in Envigado, a municipality on Medellín's southern edge, in a working-class family. His early criminal activity was unremarkable by Colombian standards of the era: petty theft, tombstone smuggling, car theft. What distinguished him wasn't the crimes themselves, but the speed with which he understood scale. By his mid-20s, he had moved into cocaine transportation, initially as a courier for established traffickers. He studied the operation, identified its inefficiencies, and eventually absorbed or eliminated the people running it. By the late 1970s, he was not working for anyone. He had built something new. The Medellín cartel was not, technically, a cartel in the traditional economic sense of a price-fixing agreement between competing firms. It was a confederation, a loose coalition of trafficking organizations centered on Escobar, but also including the Ochoa family, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio, Carlos later, and Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano. Each member brought different assets. The Ochoas had family connections and legitimate business infrastructure. Later was obsessed with logistics and had taken over the island of Norman's Key in the Bahamas as a midpoint transshipment hub for cocaine flights into Florida. Rodríguez Gacha controlled land routes and had deep ties to paramilitary networks. Escobar brought the violence and the vision. At its operational peak in the mid-1980s, the Medellín cartel was responsible for an estimated 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. The money flowing through the organization was so large it created its own logistical problems. At one point, Escobar's accountants estimated they were spending approximately $2,500 per month on rubber bands alone, just to bundle the cash. Stacks of currency were stored in warehouses and private properties across the Antioquia region. Tens of millions of dollars were buried in fields and simply lost when record keepers died or fled. That money built infrastructure. Escobar constructed private airstrips on cattle ranches across the Colombian countryside. He maintained a fleet of aircraft and a network of paid officials, customs agents, police commanders, military officers, prosecutors, and politicians who provided protection, intelligence, and operational clearance. He built low-income housing projects in Medellín's comunas and funded soccer fields and neighborhood infrastructure, cultivating loyalty among the urban poor that would prove genuinely durable. He was not simply bribing a population, he was investing in a human shield. But Escobar's foundational tool was not money, it was the threat that came with refusing it. He formalized this in a phrase that became shorthand for his entire strategic philosophy: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Accept the bribe or accept the bullet. The choice was presented as a professional courtesy. What made it effective wasn't the violence itself, but the demonstrated credibility of the threat. Escobar did not bluff. When a justice minister, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, began pushing aggressively against the cartel's political influence in 1984, he was assassinated in Bogotá. When a Colombian newspaper ran investigative pieces connecting Escobar to trafficking, the editor received threats that he took seriously. When a presidential candidate, Luis Carlos Galán, positioned himself as the anti-cartel reform candidate, he was killed at a political rally in 1989 in front of thousands of witnesses. These were not warnings, they were demonstrations. The Colombian state, at this point, was not merely corrupt, it was operationally compromised at multiple levels simultaneously. Escobar and his associates had placed paid agents inside the national police, the military intelligence apparatus, and the judiciary. Information moved. When the state moved against the cartel often knew in advance. This wasn't exceptional paranoia on Escobar's part, it was systems design. While all of this was being built in Medellín, something quieter was taking shape 500 kilometers to the southwest, in Colombia's commercial capital. Cali sat in the Cauca Valley, flat, warm, and prosperous by Colombian standards. It was a city of business, not of mountains and mountain mentality. The men who would build the Cali Cartel reflected that difference from the beginning. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela and his brother Miguel were born in Mariquita, Tolima in the 1940s and had come up through a very different criminal environment. Gilberto's early criminal record included kidnapping and bank robbery, but his natural inclination was always toward negotiation rather than confrontation. He was meticulous, patient, and genuinely intelligent in the way that institutional criminals, men who think in systems rather than in moments, tend to be. The third figure in Cali's founding structure was Helmer Pacho Herrera, who ran his own organization before eventually aligning with the Rodríguez Orejuelas, and José Santa Cruz Londoño, known as Chepe, who controlled Cali's New York distribution network with an organizational efficiency that would have impressed a legitimate logistics company. Together, these men built something structurally different from Medellín in almost every respect that mattered. Where Medellín was hierarchical and personality-dependent, Everything ultimately referred back to Escobar's authority. Cali was cellular and distributed. Operations were broken into independent units with limited cross-visibility. A mid-level manager arrested in New York could not identify his counterparts in Miami or Los Angeles because he had never met them. The information was compartmentalized by design. Cali's leadership had absorbed, consciously or by instinct, the basic operational security principles of intelligence tradecraft. And they applied those principles to narco-logistics years before law enforcement fully understood what they were dealing with. Cali also built institutional relationships that Medellín never bothered with. Where Escobar terrorized politicians, the Rodríguez Orejuelas cultivated them. They invested in legitimate businesses, pharmacies, radio stations, a professional soccer team, not merely as money laundering vehicles, but as genuine social presences that created goodwill and cover. They funded political campaigns systematically and discreetly. When a government official was useful, they paid him well and treated the relationship with professionalism. When he was no longer useful, they moved on quietly. The contrast with Escobar's methods wasn't philosophical, it was strategic. Cali's leadership had calculated that visibility was a liability and that violence, while sometimes necessary, was expensive in ways that went beyond the immediate cost. By the mid-1980s, both cartels were operating at enormous scale, and their geographic territories, Medellín's routes through the Caribbean, Cali's routes through the Pacific and Mexico, were theoretically separable. For a time, an uneasy business coexistence held. They were competitors, but the market was large enough and the operational risks of conflict were high enough that direct confrontation remained a last resort. That calculation would not hold forever. What broke it wasn't a territorial dispute or a shipment seizure. It was a series of deliberate provocations, killings, intelligence betrayals, and territorial encroachments that each side read as declarations of intent. The question of who fired the first real shot and why Cali chose to answer it the way they did would pull both organizations into a war that neither could fully control, and into which the DEA was already inserting itself, very carefully, from both sides. Pablo Escobar did not build the Medellín cartel by being the most violent man in Colombia. He built it by being the most systematic. Violence, in his operational framework, was not an expression of temperament. It was a management tool, deployed with calculated precision to solve specific problems. When it worked completely. When it failed, it escalated. And the escalation was always intentional. The architecture of the Medellín operation rested on three pillars: territorial control of cocaine processing infrastructure in the Colombian countryside, a transportation network that moved product from Colombian airstrips to transshipment points in the Caribbean and Central America, and then into the United States, and a domestic political strategy designed to prevent extradition to American courts. Of these three, the third was the one Escobar cared about most personally, and the one he was most willing to spend lives defending. Extradition terrified him. Not because of what Colombian courts might do. He had extensive influence over the Colombian judiciary, but because American federal prosecutors operated outside the reach of his money and his threats. A conviction in the United States meant a sentence he could not negotiate, served in a prison he could not run. The 1979 extradition treaty between Colombia and the United States was, from Escobar's perspective, an existential threat, and eliminating it became a strategic priority that shaped every major political decision the cartel made throughout the 1980s. The campaign against extradition was conducted on two tracks simultaneously. The first was political and financial. The cartel funded lobbying efforts and supported candidates who opposed the treaty, framing extradition in nationalist terms as a violation of Colombian sovereignty. This argument had genuine traction in a country with a complicated relationship to American interference, and Escobar was skilled enough at public relations to position himself, for a period, as a defender of Colombian dignity against Yankee imperialism. He even won a seat in the Colombian Congress in 1982 as an alternate representative, a brief experiment in political legitimacy that ended when Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla exposed his criminal background publicly and had him stripped of his credentials. That exposure was Lara Bonilla's death sentence. He was shot by assassins on motorcycles in Bogotá in April of 1984, a method that would become so associated with Medellín that the motorcyclist gunman became a kind of operational signature. The killing achieved its immediate objective. It sent an unmistakable message to every Colombian official considering a similar confrontation. But it also triggered the first in a sequence of strategic miscalculations that would define Escobar's long decline. Colombian President Belisario Betancourt, who had previously resisted pressure to enforce the extradition treaty, was sufficiently enraged by the assassination of one of his cabinet ministers that he reversed course and authorized extraditions. Escobar's escalation had produced the exact outcome he was trying to prevent. His response was to escalate further. This was the loop that defined his strategic logic. When pressure increased, he applied more pressure in return, operating on the theory that no government could sustain the human cost of confronting him indefinitely. He was not entirely wrong about this. The theory worked up to a point for a surprisingly long time, but it had a ceiling, and every time he pushed through that ceiling, he raised the stakes for both sides in ways that made retreat progressively more difficult. The Medellín cartel's enforcement apparatus was built around a network of sicarios, contract killers, typically young men from the comunas who were recruited in their teens, trained in weapons handling and motorcycle pursuit tactics, and paid per job. The sicario system was not invented by Escobar, but he industrialized it. Medellín's comunas, particularly the hillside barrios overlooking the city, became recruitment pools. Boys as young as 14 or 15 were absorbed into structures that offered money, status, and a kind of belonging that the formal economy could not provide. At its peak, Escobar commanded thousands of such operatives across Antioquia and beyond, a distributed paramilitary force that could be activated for everything from street-level intimidation to the assassination of a presidential candidate. The killing of Luis Carlos Galán in August of 1989 was the most consequential single act of cartel violence in Colombian history. Galán was the frontrunner for the presidency, an articulate and genuinely popular reformist who had made the dismantling of the cartels a centerpiece of his campaign. His assassination at a rally outside Bogotá was carried out in front of thousands of people and broadcast on Colombian television. The shock was not merely emotional, it was institutional. If the cartels could kill the most visible politician in the country in a public venue surrounded by security, then no official was safe. The message was received exactly as intended. But the response was not what Escobar had calculated. The Galán assassination galvanized the Colombian government in ways that previous violence had not. President Virgilio Barco declared a state of emergency and authorized military operations against cartel infrastructure at a scale that had not been attempted before. Crucially, he also reinstated extraditions by executive decree, bypassing the legislative process entirely. Within weeks, Colombian authorities had extradited several cartel-linked individuals to the United States. Not major figures, but enough to demonstrate that the mechanism worked and would be used again. Escobar's answer was to declare war on the Colombian state directly. The campaign he launched between 1989 and 1993 has few precedents in the history of organized crime. It was not a criminal organization defending itself from law enforcement. It was a sub-state armed group conducting a sustained insurgency against a national government. Car bombs detonated in Bogotá's commercial districts. The headquarters of the DAS, Colombia's national intelligence agency, was destroyed by a truck bomb in December of 1989, killing more than 60 people and injuring hundreds more. Avianca Flight 203 was brought down by a bomb in November of that same year, killing all 107 people on board and 3 more on the ground. The intended target was presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, who had changed his travel plans at the last minute. Police officers in Medellín were killed at a rate that, at the height of the campaign, reached multiple per day. Bounties were placed on officers publicly, 100,000 pesos per badge, paid in cash. This last tactic was operationally brilliant and strategically disastrous. In the short term, it worked. Police morale collapsed in some sectors, recruitment fell, and officers in certain precincts became reluctant to conduct active operations against cartel infrastructure. But it also created a constituency for Escobar's destruction that proved permanent. The families of dead officers, the surviving colleagues, the commanders who had watched their units decimated. These people did not forget, and they did not stop working. When a special police unit called the Bloc de Búsqueda was eventually formed with the specific and sole mission of finding Pablo Escobar, it was staffed by men with personal stakes in the outcome. Meanwhile, the cartel's financial infrastructure was becoming a target in its own right. The scale of cocaine revenues, estimates for the late 1980s range from $2 billion to $4 billion annually for the Medellín operation alone, required sophisticated laundering mechanisms that, paradoxically, created exposure. Currency transaction reporting requirements in the United States were forcing traffickers to structure deposits in complex ways that generated paper trails. Real estate purchases in Miami, cattle ranches in Colombia, construction companies in Panama, each asset created records. DEA and FinCEN analysts were learning to follow those records backward to their sources, building financial maps of the organization that complemented the operational intelligence being gathered by Colombian police and military units. The DEA's role in Colombia during this period was formally limited by sovereignty considerations. American agents could advise and share intelligence, but could not conduct direct operations on Colombian soil. In practice, the relationship was considerably more fluid. DEA assets embedded with Colombian police units provided real-time tactical intelligence. Electronic surveillance capabilities that Colombia did not independently possess were contributed through intelligence sharing arrangements. Liaison officers at the American Embassy in Bogotá maintained working relationships with Colombian military commanders that functioned, in operational terms, as something close to joint command structures. The legal distinction between advising and participating became increasingly notional as the pressure intensified. What the DEA understood, and what would eventually prove decisive, was that Escobar's greatest vulnerability was not his money or his weapons. It was his need to communicate. Running an organization of this complexity from hiding, as he was forced to do after going underground in 1992, required constant contact with his lieutenants, his family, his lawyers, and his financial managers. Every communication was a potential intercept. Every intercept was a potential location. The technical challenge was triangulating a signal before it could be moved, and the intelligence challenge was ensuring that the information reached the people who could act on it before the window closed. That challenge was made harder by the fact that Escobar had sources inside the agencies hunting him. He changed safe houses frequently, sometimes daily. He varied his communication schedules. He used couriers for the most sensitive messages. But he could not disappear entirely, because disappearing entirely meant losing control of an organization that required his personal authority to function. The very structure that had made Medellín powerful, its centralization around a single dominant personality, was now its most dangerous weakness. And there was a second pressure that Escobar had not fully accounted for. While the Colombian state and the DEA were hunting him from one direction, a private intelligence operation was converging on him from another. It was funded by narco money. It was staffed by professionals. And it was operating with information that could only have come from inside his own organization. The group was called Los Pepes, Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. It included cartel enemies, former associates who had broken with Escobar, right-wing paramilitary figures, and, according to evidence that emerged in subsequent years, significant logistical and intelligence support from the Cali Cartel. The Rodríguez Orejuelas had concluded that Escobar's war against the state was damaging to their own business. The increased law enforcement pressure generated by his terrorism was disrupting trafficking operations industry-wide, and that his elimination was in their commercial interest. They did not publicly claim Los Pepes. They did not need to. They simply made sure that certain information reached certain people at certain times. The precise nature of Cali's involvement in the final months of the hunt for Escobar remains one of the most debated questions in the historiography of this period. What is documented is that Los Pepes had access to intelligence about Escobar's safe houses, financial holdings, and associate networks that went well beyond what any vigilante group could have assembled independently. Properties associated with Escobar's family were bombed. Lawyers representing him were killed. The information behind these operations was specific and current. Someone was feeding it, and that someone had the resources and the motivation to do so systematically. The DEA's awareness of this parallel operation created an uncomfortable institutional problem. Los Pepes were committing murders. Some of their targets were civilians connected to Escobar only tangentially. The line between intelligence cooperation and complicity in extrajudicial killing was not easy to draw in real time, and American officials were aware that their Colombian counterparts had relationships with the group that were difficult to fully characterize. The decision made, implicitly, never formally articulated, was to treat Los Pepes as background noise while focusing on the official operation. The result was effective. The ethics were complicated and remained so. On December 2, 1993, the Bloque de Búsqueda located Escobar in a middle-class residential neighborhood in Medellín. The phone call had gone too long. The triangulation was precise. The assault was fast. Escobar was shot dead on a rooftop while attempting to flee, one day after his 44th birthday. Whether the final bullet was fired by police or self-inflicted has been debated ever since. But the outcome was unambiguous. The Medellín cartel died with him, not because the organization was incapable of surviving his death, but because it had been built around his personal authority in a way that made succession structurally impossible. Within months, the Confederation had fragmented into smaller competing groups. The cocaine routes were still there. The processing infrastructure was largely intact. The product was still moving. But the entity that had held it together was gone. In Cali, the mood was not celebration. Or rather, it was celebration with an edge. The Rodríguez Orejuelas understood that Escobar's death had solved one problem and created another. For years, their organization had operated in relative comfort, partly because the Colombian state and its American partners had been consumed by the Medellín threat. That threat was now resolved. The focus would shift. And Cali, despite all its sophistication and all its careful architecture, was not invisible. The question was how long they had, and whether the things that had kept them safe from Medellín could also keep them safe from what was coming next. The Cali Cartel's greatest achievement was not moving cocaine. It was moving cocaine while appearing, to most of the world, to be doing something else entirely. The Rodríguez Orejuela brothers understood something that Escobar never fully grasped. In a country with weak institutions, visibility is not power. It is a target. Every public display of force, every assassination that made headlines, every bomb that disrupted civilian life was an advertisement for law enforcement attention. Escobar had turned himself into a symbol, and symbols can be hunted. Cali's leadership made a deliberate strategic choice to remain invisible, not because they lacked the capacity for violence, but because they had calculated that invisibility was operationally superior in almost every scenario they could model. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela was, by all accounts of people who dealt with him, a man who could have run a legitimate corporation. He was methodical, personable in a controlled way, and genuinely analytical. He read widely. He kept detailed records, a habit that would eventually contribute to his downfall, but which reflected the instinct of a man who thought in systems. His brother Miguel was more operationally focused, harder-edged, and handled the day-to-day management of trafficking logistics with the attention to detail of a supply chain executive. Between them, They built an organization whose internal culture was closer to a professional services firm than to a paramilitary confederation. This was not accidental. The Cali leadership had studied what made criminal organizations fail, and they had identified two primary causes: internal betrayal and external pressure. Both could be managed with the right architecture. For internal betrayal, the answer was compartmentalization and financial incentive. Pay people well enough that defection doesn't make economic sense, and structure information so that no single individual knows enough to bring down the whole organization. For external pressure, the answer was political investment and institutional capture. Make the organization so embedded in the legitimate economy and the political class that attacking it carries prohibitive collateral costs. The Cali Cartel's cocaine operation was divided into cells that operated with significant autonomy. A cell running distribution in New York did not have direct knowledge of the cell running distribution in Los Angeles. The financial managers did not have full visibility into the transportation network. The transportation managers did not know the identities of the political contacts. This design meant that a single arrest, even of a senior figure, could not unravel the whole structure. Each captured node was a dead end that led investigators to the perimeter of another compartment, not to the center of the operation. American law enforcement analysts who worked Cali cases in the late 1980s described the experience as trying to map a building by touching its exterior walls. You could feel the scale, but could not see inside. The financial architecture was correspondingly sophisticated. The Rodríguez Orejuelas owned or controlled a substantial portfolio of legitimate businesses in Cali and across Colombia. The most significant was Drogas La Rebaja, a pharmacy chain that grew to hundreds of locations and became one of the country's largest retail networks. The pharmacies served multiple functions simultaneously. They were genuine commercial operations that generated real revenue. They provided employment and community presence that created goodwill, and they were conduits through which drug proceeds could be laundered by commingling with legitimate cash flows. A pharmacy chain that processes thousands of small transactions per day across hundreds of locations is, from a financial forensics perspective, extremely difficult to audit cleanly. They also owned América de Cali, one of Colombia's most prominent professional soccer clubs, which they ran with genuine enthusiasm and used to cultivate relationships with the city's civic and commercial elite. The club's success on the field: it won 5 consecutive Colombian championship titles in the early 1990s, made the Rodríguez Orejuelas local heroes in ways that insulated them from community pressure and complicated any government effort to portray them as straightforwardly criminal. A man who brings a championship to your city is harder to arrest than a man who blows up your police headquarters. The political investment strategy was long-term and systematic. Cali did not simply bribe officials when needed, as Medellín did. They identified promising political careers early, provided financial support through multiple elections, and cultivated relationships that created genuine, reciprocal loyalty over time. The distinction mattered operationally. A bribed official acts out of fear or short-term interest and remains a liability. He can be flipped, replaced, or pressured from the other direction. An official who has received support over a decade, whose career is intertwined with your patronage network, who has introduced his family to yours at social functions, is a different kind of asset. He has skin in the outcome. His interests are aligned with yours in ways that go beyond the transactional. The most damaging manifestation of this strategy would only become fully visible years later, when investigations into the 1994 Colombian presidential campaign of Ernesto Samper revealed that approximately $6 million in Cali Cartel money had been funneled into his campaign. This was not a payment for a specific service. It was an investment in a political relationship, one that, if it had held, would have given Cali significant influence over the Colombian government at the precise moment when that government was under the most American pressure to act against them. The scandal, known as Proceso 8000, nearly brought down Samper's presidency and poisoned U.S.-Colombian relations for years. But before it unraveled, it illustrated exactly how deeply the Cali model of political integration could penetrate. Cali's intelligence operation was the aspect of their structure that most clearly distinguished them from any previous criminal organization. The Rodríguez Orejuelas maintained what amounted to a private intelligence service, a team of analysts and field operatives whose function was to track threats to the organization. This included monitoring law enforcement movements, identifying informants within their own structure, tracking the activities of rival organizations, and gathering compromising information on officials who might need to be recruited or neutralized. Former Colombian intelligence officials and DEA analysts who later described this operation used terms that belong to the vocabulary of state agencies, not criminal enterprises. Counter-surveillance, source validation, operational security audits. The intelligence unit used sophisticated communications monitoring equipment, maintained informants within Colombian police and military units, and had contacts inside the American embassy in Bogotá who provided, wittingly or unwittingly, advance warning of certain law enforcement activities. The DEA was aware that its operational security in Colombia was compromised to a degree that was difficult to fully assess. Information about pending operations sometimes preceded the operations themselves, and the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. This awareness shaped how the most sensitive Cali intelligence was handled, with information being compartmentalized even within the DEA itself in ways that created significant operational friction. The contrast with Medellin's intelligence posture was stark. Escobar had informants inside law enforcement, but his primary protection was the threat of violence. He relied on deterrence more than on anticipation. Cali relied on anticipation almost exclusively. They wanted to know what was coming before it arrived, so they could adjust rather than respond. Adjustment is always cheaper than response, in both money and exposure. The violence that Cali did employ was distinctive in its targeting and its methodology. Where Escobar killed broadly, car bombs designed to create mass casualties, bounties that encouraged indiscriminate killing of police officers, Cali's violence was surgical. Targets were specific, operations were planned carefully. The goal was always to solve a discrete problem with minimum collateral noise. A rival distributor encroaching on Cali's New York territory would be killed in a way that looked like a street crime, not a cartel hit. A potential informant would disappear rather than be found publicly. An official who could not be purchased and posed a real threat might be killed, but the operation would be designed to look unconnected to the Cali organization specifically. This methodology had a significant secondary benefit. It made attribution difficult. When Medellín killed someone, the signature was usually unmistakable. The motorcycle approach, the multiple shots, the scale of the operation. When Cali killed someone, investigators often could not immediately connect the death to the cartel at all. The absence of a recognizable pattern was itself a kind of operational cover. The relationship between the two cartels during the 1980s was defined by a fragile commercial coexistence that both organizations understood to be temporary. They operated in nominally separate corridors. Medellin's primary routes ran through the Caribbean, the Bahamas transshipment network that Carlos later had developed, and later the Caribbean island chains into Miami and the Florida coast. Cali's routes ran westward through the Pacific and increasingly through Mexico, using relationships with Mexican trafficking organizations that would eventually become something much larger. Both organizations had distribution networks in the United States, but the geographic concentrations were different enough that direct territorial conflict was, for a period, avoidable. The roots of open conflict stretched back to 1981, when members of a leftist guerrilla group kidnapped Marta Nieves Ochoa, the sister of the Ochoa brothers, who were among Escobar's key confederates. That kidnapping prompted the Medellín leadership to form a joint enforcement group called MAS, Muerte a Secuestradores, Death to Kidnappers, a rare instance of the Confederation acting collectively and with coordinated violence in response to a direct provocation. The episode established a precedent. When the Medellín organization felt genuinely threatened, it would respond at scale. Cali watched and took note. Through the mid and late 1980s, the two organizations maintained their uneasy distance. But a series of incidents, territorial encroachments in American distribution markets, mutual accusations of informing to law enforcement, and the killing of several Cali-linked individuals by Medellín operatives steadily eroded whatever trust remained. Cali interpreted these killings not as collateral friction, but as deliberate signals of intent. The Rodríguez Orejuelas did not respond with a counterstrike. They responded with something more characteristic of their approach. They began systematically feeding information about Escobar's infrastructure to Colombian law enforcement. This was not altruism, and it was not patriotism. It was competitive strategy, pursued through the channel where Cali held the greatest advantage, intelligence, against the domain where Escobar was strongest, which was direct violence. Escobar registered the betrayal and moved to answer it on his own terms. In January of 1988, a car bomb destroyed the Monaco building in Medellín, a residential property owned by Escobar himself. The bomb had been placed by a Cali-linked team. The blast injured Escobar's wife and daughter, who were inside the building at the time. For Escobar, this was no longer a business dispute, it was personal. He declared that the coexistence was finished and began directing cartel resources toward a direct campaign against the Rodríguez Orejuelas. Bombings in Cali, assassination attempts against their associates, and operations designed to disrupt their distribution infrastructure in the United States. What followed was an asymmetric conflict in which each side fought on the terrain where it held the advantage. Medellín brought violence, bombings, shootings, attacks on Cali-linked properties and personnel. Cali brought intelligence, a steady flow of location data, organizational charts, and financial information directed toward the Bloque de Busqueda and through carefully managed channels toward the DEA. Medellín was optimized for offensive operations. It could generate violence quickly and at scale, but it was vulnerable to penetration because its centralized command structure required constant communication. Cali was optimized for survival and information. It could gather and process intelligence with exceptional efficiency, but it was not designed for sustained offensive military action. The war therefore played out primarily in the intelligence domain, not on the streets, at least from Cali's side. And in the intelligence domain, Cali was winning. The stream of actionable information about Escobar's movements, associates, and safe houses constituted a form of warfare that left no fingerprints and required no direct confrontation. It was precise, patient, and effective. And by the time Escobar died on that Medellín rooftop in December of 1993, Cali had achieved something almost without precedent. They had contributed materially to their enemy's destruction without ever being publicly implicated in the hunt. In Cali, Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela said very little when the news came through. He had been expecting it for months. What occupied his attention now was not celebration, it was calculation. Because the DEA had not been watching Medellín exclusively, they had been watching Cali too, for years, quietly, building something patient and very large. And with Escobar gone, there was no longer anything standing between that investigation and its primary target. The gentlemen of Cali had outmaneuvered the most dangerous man in Colombia. The question now was whether they could outmaneuver the United States government. The DEA's Cali task force had a name that reflected its institutional ambition: Operation Cornerstone. It had been running since the late 1980s, accumulating evidence, mapping financial networks, and building the kind of prosecutorial architecture that American federal attorneys need before they can move against targets of this complexity. But throughout the Escobar years, Cornerstone had operated under a constraint that was never formally articulated, but was universally understood inside the agency. Medellín was the priority. Cali could wait. After December of 1993, Cali could no longer wait. The shift in American and Colombian government attention was not instantaneous. Institutions rarely pivot cleanly, but the direction was unmistakable within weeks of Escobar's death. Congressional pressure on the DEA to demonstrate continued progress in Colombia intensified. The State Department's Narcotics Bureau began pushing for a comprehensive strategy against the organization, that now controlled the dominant share of cocaine entering the United States. And within the DEA itself, agents who had spent years building Cali cases found that the bureaucratic resistance to aggressive action had suddenly diminished. The obstacle had been removed. The file was now at the top of the stack. What those agents had built over nearly a decade was formidable. The financial investigation alone had produced a partial map of the cartel's money laundering infrastructure that spanned multiple countries and implicated dozens of financial institutions. One DEA analyst, working out of the Miami field office, had spent 3 years reconstructing a single wire transfer chain, a sequence of transactions that moved cocaine proceeds from a wholesale buyer in Queens through shell companies in Panama and Luxembourg, before surfacing as a real estate purchase in Bogota. The chain was clean at every step. The documentation was professional. The institutions involved had no obvious reason to ask questions. It had taken 3 years to map 22 transactions. Cali had run thousands of chains like it simultaneously. DEA analysts had also identified the general structure of the cellular distribution network in the United States and had turned several mid-level Cali operatives who provided insider accounts of how the organization functioned. They understood, at least in outline, the political protection strategy and had documented connections between cartel money and Colombian political figures. What they lacked was the kind of real-time operational intelligence, current safehouse locations, live communications intercepts, movement data, that would allow them to arrest senior leadership rather than simply continuing to roll up peripheral figures who knew only their own small corner of the structure. Getting that intelligence required going inside the organization in ways that presented significant legal and ethical complications. The DEA's most valuable tool in this period was a series of cooperating witnesses, former Cali operatives who had been arrested on drug charges in the United States and had agreed to provide information in exchange for reduced sentences. These individuals had genuine knowledge of the organization's structure and methods, but their information was necessarily retrospective. They knew how things had worked when they were active, not how things were working now. The cartel's compartmentalization meant that even senior figures who cooperated could not provide complete current intelligence. They knew their own compartment. The rest was inference. The Colombian government's posture toward Cali had been ambiguous for years, and that ambiguity did not immediately resolve after Escobar's death. President Cesar Gaviria, whose administration had overseen the final pursuit of Escobar, was succeeded by Ernesto Samper in August of 1994. Samper's election and the subsequent revelation that approximately $6 million in Cali Cartel money had been funneled into his campaign created a diplomatic crisis that fundamentally complicated the bilateral relationship between Colombia and the United States. The Clinton administration, confronting evidence that the Colombian president had accepted narco money, was forced into a series of difficult decisions about how to pursue Cali through a government whose own leadership was compromised at its highest level. The American response was the decertification of Colombia, a formal State Department determination that Colombia had failed to meet its counter-narcotics cooperation obligations, which triggered cuts in American aid and the imposition of diplomatic sanctions. The decertification was designed to pressure the Colombian government to act against the Cali leadership, regardless of the political cost. It was also, from the perspective of Colombian sovereignty, deeply humiliating, and it generated resentment that complicated practical cooperation even as it increased formal cooperation. Politicians who might otherwise have moved cautiously against the cartel now had an additional reason to do so, not out of loyalty to Washington, but out of a need to demonstrate that Colombia could manage its own affairs. What resolved this tension, ultimately, was not American pressure alone, but a convergence of interests within the Colombian security apparatus itself. The Colombian National Police, under the leadership of General Rosso José Serrano, had been building its own Cali investigation with a degree of institutional commitment that was not dependent on the presidency's political calculations. Serrano was, by all contemporary accounts, genuinely committed to dismantling the Cali organization and was willing to accept the personal risks that entailed. In a country where law enforcement officials who moved against powerful criminal organizations sometimes received their answer in the form of a motorcycle and 2 gunmen, that commitment was not a formality. The intelligence breakthrough that made the arrests possible came from multiple directions simultaneously, a pattern that reflected the cumulative pressure that had been building for years. Communications intercepts, conducted with American technical assistance, began producing actionable location data. Informants within the cartel's peripheral networks were providing current information about safe house usage and movement patterns. And critically, the Cali organization itself was beginning to show stress fractures under the sustained investigative pressure. Senior figures were making decisions, staying in familiar locations longer than they should, using communication channels they had previously avoided, relying on intermediaries who had already been identified by law enforcement, that reflected the cognitive strain of operating a complex organization while simultaneously evading a determined manhunt. The first significant arrest came on June 9, 1995. Colombian National Police, acting on a combination of communications, surveillance, and human source intelligence, raided a location in Cali and found Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela concealed inside a hidden compartment built into a wall of the building. He had been in that space for hours. The man who had constructed an entire criminal philosophy around invisibility and institutional integration was found hiding inside a wall in his own city, in a building on a street he had known for decades. The image captured something essential about how completely the operational environment had shifted around him. Gilberto's capture did not immediately unravel the organization. The compartmentalized structure was designed to survive exactly this scenario. The loss of a single leader, even the most senior one, was not supposed to be fatal. Miguel Rodríguez Orejuela, the more operationally focused of the 2 brothers, assumed full control and attempted to keep the structure running. But the cognitive and logistical load was immense. An organization designed to function with distributed authority was now being managed by a single individual who was simultaneously running trafficking operations, managing political relationships, directing internal security, and trying to evade capture. The design had been intended to prevent this kind of centralization. Circumstances were forcing it anyway. Miguel was arrested on August 6, 1995, less than 2 months after his brother. The operation followed the same pattern. Communication surveillance combined with human intelligence produced a location, and a rapid police action closed the window before it could be moved. He too was found in a concealed space inside a private residence in Cali. 2 arrests, 58 days apart, in the same city, using the same basic methodology. The organization had failed to adapt between the first and second operation, which said something important about how completely its internal warning systems had been degraded. The arrests of both Rodríguez Orejuela brothers within 2 months of each other represented a genuine law enforcement achievement, but they did not end the Cali Cartel as a functioning entity. Trafficking operations continued under the remaining leadership. José Santa Cruz Londoño, Chepe, who had built and maintained Cali's American distribution network with exceptional operational discipline, was still free and still running product. Helmer Pacho Herrera, whose independent organization had aligned with Cali years earlier, was similarly at large. The cartel had been struck at its center, but not dismantled at its edges. Santa Cruz Londoño's end came in stages. He escaped from a Colombian prison in January of 1996, an escape that illustrated the cartel's residual capacity for institutional corruption even after its leadership had been captured and its political protection had begun to erode. Colombian corrections officials had been paid. Doors had been opened. He walked out. But the intelligence environment around him had deteriorated too completely to sustain a fugitive existence at the level he required. Colombian police located and killed him in March of 1996, 3 months after his escape. Pacho Herrera, reading the situation accurately, surrendered to Colombian authorities later that year. He calculated, correctly as events would show, that surrender offered better personal outcomes than indefinite flight in an environment where every day brought new arrests and new informants. The Colombian legal proceedings that followed were, from the American perspective, deeply unsatisfying. The Rodríguez Orejuelas negotiated plea arrangements with Colombian prosecutors that produced sentences significantly shorter than American authorities believed were appropriate for the scale of their crimes. The Colombian legal framework offered substantial sentencing reductions for voluntary cooperation and surrender, and the brothers' lawyers used every available mechanism. Gilberto received a sentence of approximately 15 years. Miguel received a comparable term. DEA officials and American federal prosecutors, who had spent nearly a decade building cases that, under American federal sentencing guidelines, would have produced sentences measured in decades, expressed their frustration through formal diplomatic channels and through the press. The extradition issue sat at the center of this frustration. The Colombian Constitution, amended in 1991, prohibited the extradition of Colombian nationals, a provision that the cartels had invested heavily and deliberately in achieving, understanding that American courts represented the one system they could not adequately corrupt or intimidate. Removing that prohibition became a sustained American diplomatic objective throughout the mid-1990s. The Colombian Supreme Court and Constitutional Assembly debated the issue across multiple years, with the ultimate resolution shaped by a combination of American pressure, the Samper scandal's political damage, and a growing recognition within Colombian legal and political institutions that the prohibition was being exploited precisely as the cartels had intended. The extradition prohibition was removed from the Colombian Constitution in 1997. The Rodríguez Orejuelas were extradited to the United States in 2004, where they faced federal drug trafficking charges in American courts. Gilberto pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 30 years. Miguel pleaded guilty and received 26 years. By the time those sentences were handed down, both men were in their 60s. The cells they occupied in American federal prisons were considerably less comfortable than the hidden compartments in Cali, where they had been found 9 years earlier. What the DEA had learned from the Cali operation, accumulated across nearly a decade of investigative work, reshaped American narcotics enforcement in ways that extended well beyond Colombia. The financial investigation had demonstrated conclusively that following money, not just product, not just people, was the most reliable path to senior cartel leadership. Senior leaders insulated themselves from operational exposure, but could not fully insulate their financial infrastructure, because money, unlike people, must pass through systems that generate records. The cellular network analysis produced frameworks for mapping compartmentalized criminal organizations that became templates for subsequent investigations. The experience of operating within a bilaterally compromised intelligence environment had refined protocols for handling sensitive information that were applied to operations in other countries for years afterward. But perhaps the most significant institutional lesson was the one the DEA's own analysts were most reluctant to state directly. The Cali operation had been a success, and cocaine availability in the United States had not measurably declined as a result. The supply chain had survived the organizations that built it. The routes were open. The market was intact. New operators were absorbing the capacity faster than law enforcement could track them. Two of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in history had been dismantled, and the product was still moving, in some assessments, in greater volume than before, because the disruption of established structures had created competitive pressure that drove new entrants to increase supply aggressively. That recognition did not diminish the achievement. It complicated it, and it raised a question that nobody in Washington or Bogotá was entirely prepared to answer. If destroying the cartels didn't reduce the cocaine, what exactly had been won? The cocaine did not stop moving the day Pablo Escobar died. It did not stop moving the day Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela was pulled from a hidden compartment in a Cali wall. The supply chain that the two cartels had built over 15 years, the cultivation networks in Peru and Bolivia, the processing laboratories scattered across the Colombian jungle, the transshipment corridors threading through Central America and the Caribbean, the distribution cells embedded in American cities from Miami to Chicago to Los Angeles. All of that infrastructure survived the men who had built it. What changed was ownership. In the immediate aftermath of Escobar's death, the Medellín Cartel's operations were absorbed not by a single successor organization, but by a collection of smaller groups that had been operating in its shadow. Some were former Medellín affiliates who had maintained independent structures and now simply expanded into the vacuum. Others were entirely new actors who recognized that the collapse of the Confederation represented a commercial opportunity of historic proportions. The Norte del Valle Cartel, based in the Colombian departments north of Cali, moved quickly to claim portions of the abandoned infrastructure. Smaller organizations in Bogotá, along the Caribbean coast, and in the border regions with Venezuela and Ecuador, expanded into spaces that Medellín's enforcement apparatus had previously controlled through the credible threat of extreme violence. Without that threat, the spaces were open. The fragmentation was not chaotic. It was, in a sense, a market correction. The cocaine trade was a business, and like any business, it sought equilibrium after a major disruption. The new operators were by and large men who had learned from watching what happened to Escobar, and the primary lesson they had drawn was the one Cali had been demonstrating for years: visibility kills. The successors to Medellín did not build public personas. They did not fund housing projects in their own names. They did not run for Congress. They kept their heads down, kept the product moving, and avoided every behavior that had made Escobar a target. The Cali Cartel's collapse produced a different and more consequential kind of fragmentation, one that permanently restructured the entire narcotics trade at the global level. Because Cali had built extensive relationships with Mexican trafficking organizations during its operational years, using the Mexicans primarily as transporters who moved cocaine across the final border crossing into the United States, the collapse of the Colombian supply-side organization created a leverage opportunity that the Mexican partners moved swiftly to exploit. They already had the routes. They already had the border crossing infrastructure developed across years of practice. They already had the wholesale distribution relationships with American buyers. What they had lacked was negotiating power over the Colombian producers who controlled the product at its source. With Cali gone and Medellín gone, the producers were dealing with their customers directly, and the customers had options. By the late 1990s, Mexican trafficking organizations, principally the organizations that would solidify into what became known as the Sinaloa Cartel and the Gulf Cartel, had fundamentally renegotiated the terms of their relationship with Colombian cocaine producers. Where the Colombians had previously paid the Mexicans a transportation fee in cash or product, the new arrangements gave the Mexican organizations equity in the distribution process itself, ownership of the American market segment, not merely access to it. The Colombians retained control of production, which was considerable, but the Mexicans took control of the final mile distribution into American consumer markets, and distribution is where the margin concentrates. The power center of the global cocaine trade had moved north and west, across the Rio Grande, into a geography and a political context that would present American law enforcement with a set of challenges that made the Colombian experience look, in retrospect, almost tractable by comparison. The DEA's experience in Colombia had been, by any reasonable institutional metric, a success. Two of the most powerful criminal organizations in history had been dismantled within a decade of each other. Their senior leadership was dead, imprisoned, or in American federal custody. The Colombian state had been strengthened, imperfectly, unevenly, with significant ongoing problems of corruption and institutional capacity, but strengthened nonetheless by the experience of confronting organizations that had at various points seemed capable of capturing it entirely. General Serrano's National Police had developed investigative capabilities that outlasted the specific operations of the 1990s. The intelligence-sharing frameworks between Colombian and American agencies, refined through years of operational friction and diplomatic difficulty, had produced working relationships that continued to generate results long after the original targets were gone. But the human cost of the decade between Escobar's first major escalation and the final Cali arrests was staggering in ways that statistics only partially convey. Colombia lost 3 presidential candidates, a sitting attorney general, hundreds of judges and prosecutors, and thousands of police officers to cartel violence. The city of Medellín, at the peak of the conflict, recorded approximately 380 homicides per 100,000 residents in 1991, a rate that made it the most violent city in the world by a substantial margin, and a number that becomes comprehensible only when you understand that it represented the systematic elimination of anyone who posed a credible institutional threat to a single man's business interests. Entire judicial and law enforcement careers were defined by the binary choice between accepting protection money and risking assassination for doing the job. The institutional trauma of that period shaped Colombian governance for a generation in ways that outlasted any single policy or reform. The comunas of Medellín, where Escobar had recruited his sicarios and built his political base among the urban poor, were left after his death with the structural conditions that had made that recruitment possible largely intact. Poverty remained. Formal employment remained scarce. State presence in the hillside barrios remained inconsistent. The vacuum created by the cartel's collapse was filled, in many neighborhoods, not by government institutions, but by paramilitary organizations, principally the AUC, the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, which absorbed many former cartel operatives and continued to control territory through violence while presenting themselves to those who needed a pretext as anti-guerrilla forces. The political economy of armed control in the comunas did not end with Escobar. It changed management, updated its branding, and continued. Cali's legitimate business infrastructure created a different kind of legacy problem. The pharmacy chain, the real estate holdings, the soccer club, the radio stations. These assets had been built with drug money, but it also employed thousands of people who had no criminal involvement and had simply taken jobs at companies that happened to be cartel-owned. The process of asset forfeiture and legal adjudication that followed the cartel's collapse took years and created genuine economic disruption in the Cauca Valley. The entanglement of criminal and legitimate economies, which had been a feature of the Cali model's operational strength, became a feature of its complicated and painful dismantling. Separating the two was like trying to unbake a cake. The ingredients were structurally inseparable by the time anyone attempted it. The political damage from the Samper campaign financing scandal had consequences that extended well beyond the immediate diplomatic crisis between Bogotá and Washington. It demonstrated, in a way that could not be minimized or explained away, that the Cali Cartel's investment in political capture had nearly succeeded at the highest level of Colombian government. A sitting president had accepted narco money in a democratic election. The organization had nearly purchased the executive branch of a sovereign state. That fact accelerated constitutional and institutional reforms designed to create greater separation between political figures and criminal money, to strengthen campaign finance transparency, and to insulate judicial processes from political interference. Those reforms were imperfect and incompletely enforced, as reforms in stressed institutions tend to be. But they reflected a genuine recognition that the Cali model of political integration represented a systemic threat that required systemic responses, not just the prosecution of individuals, but the restructuring of the systems those individuals had exploited. The DEA's own institutional evolution in this period is worth examining carefully, because it illustrates how law enforcement organizations learn from operational experience when they are honest about what that experience revealed. The Cornerstone investigation had exposed significant vulnerabilities in the DEA's operational security. The awareness that Cali had informants providing advance warning of some operations forced a systematic review of how sensitive intelligence was handled in bilateral investigations. The development of what became known as sensitive investigative units, vetted, polygraphed Colombian law enforcement personnel who were given access to intelligence not shared with the broader Colombian security apparatus, was a direct and deliberate response to the penetration problem that Cali had exploited for years. The model was subsequently applied to bilateral investigations in Mexico, Central America, and elsewhere. The use of financial intelligence as a primary investigative tool, rather than a supplementary one deployed after operational leads had already been developed, was institutionalized in ways that reshaped how American authorities pursued transnational criminal organizations across the following decade. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control began designating cartel-linked entities and individuals in ways that imposed economic costs without requiring criminal prosecution, a mechanism that could be applied faster and with a lower evidentiary threshold than federal indictments. The Cali investigation had demonstrated that the financial architecture of a criminal organization was both its most durable vulnerability and the area where American investigative capabilities had genuine comparative advantage. That recognition drove investment priorities in narcotics enforcement for years. The successors to both cartels drew their own lessons, and they drew them with precision. The Norte del Valle cartel, which briefly emerged as the dominant Colombian trafficking organization in the late 1990s, was more violent than Cali and more fragmented than Medellín, a hybrid that incorporated the worst operational features of both predecessors while lacking the organizational coherence that had made either genuinely formidable at its peak. It produced extraordinary internal violence. Its leadership killed each other with a consistency that rivaled any external law enforcement pressure, and was dismantled through a combination of that self-destruction and targeted operations that were considerably easier to execute against an organization that lacked Cali's institutional protections and Medellín's disciplined enforcement structure. By the mid-2000s, it had effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity. The FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, had maintained a complex and evolving relationship with cocaine trafficking throughout the cartel era, initially taxing cultivation in territories it controlled, and gradually becoming more directly involved in processing and transportation as its traditional funding sources eroded. After both cartels collapsed, FARC emerged as a significant player in the production segment of the market, controlling cultivation and laboratory operations in remote areas where state presence remained negligible. This added a counterinsurgency dimension to what had been, during the cartel era, primarily a law enforcement and judicial problem, a complication that shaped American involvement in Colombia through Plan Colombia, launched in 2000 and well into the following decade. Plan Colombia itself, the multi-billion-dollar American assistance program that combined military aid, counter-narcotics support, aerial eradication, and development funding, was, in significant part, a direct response to the lessons of the cartel era. It reflected the recognition that the DEA's operational successes against Medellín and Cali, real as they were, had not reduced cocaine availability in the United States, because the underlying agricultural and economic infrastructure that sustained production had survived the organizations dismantled above it. Eradicating the supply required addressing not just the trafficking organizations, but the conditions, the poverty, the state absence, the lack of alternative livelihoods that made coca cultivation the most rational economic choice for hundreds of thousands of Colombian farmers. Whether Plan Colombia fully achieved that objective is a question analysts continue to debate. That its rationale was traceable directly to the strategic failures that had accompanied the tactical successes of the 1990s is not in dispute. The long arc of both cartels' stories ends, as such stories always do, not with a single decisive moment, but with a gradual dispersal into the systems they had deformed. The money they had moved, estimates across the full operational period of both organizations range into the tens of billions of dollars, had touched the Colombian economy at every level, from the rural farmer growing coca leaf on a hillside in Putumayo to the Bogotá banker processing suspicious wire transfers without asking the questions he should have asked. Unwinding that integration was and remains an incomplete project. Some of the political relationships that Cali cultivated have never been fully mapped. Some of the financial flows from the Medellín era have never been fully traced. The institutions that were corrupted, weakened, or simply bent out of shape by a decade of cartel dominance carry those marks in ways that are sometimes invisible from the outside, but are not gone. What remains most instructive about the Medellín and Cali story, viewed with the distance that time provides, is not the scale of the violence, or the volume of the money, or even the individual personalities, though all of those are extraordinary. It is the organizational experiment that the two cartels conducted simultaneously, in the same country, at the same time, with the same product and the same market. Escobar built a centralized, personality-driven, violence-dependent organization that achieved enormous power quickly, generated enormous pressure on itself through that very visibility, and collapsed catastrophically the moment its central node was removed. The Rodríguez Orejuelas built a distributed, institutionally embedded, intelligence-dependent organization that achieved comparable power more slowly and sustained itself through sophisticated architecture. It could not survive indefinitely under the combination of sustained investigative pressure and the collapse of its political protection. But it lasted longer, cost more to dismantle, and left deeper institutional damage than anything Medellín had produced. Neither model was sustainable. Both produced outcomes, in human lives, in institutional damage, in long-term social cost, that were catastrophic for the country that hosted them. But the comparison between the two is not merely a historical curiosity. The organizational principles each cartel embodied, centralization versus distribution, violence versus corruption, speed versus durability, are the same principles that every subsequent criminal organization operating at scale has had to navigate. The cartels were, among other things, a controlled experiment in criminal management conducted at national scale. And the results of that experiment have been studied, absorbed, and applied by organizations operating today in contexts very different from 1980s Colombia. The classroom was Medellín and Cali. The graduates are still in business. The cocaine is still moving. The routes have changed. The organizations have changed. The scale has not. Here is the question worth sitting with. Can intelligence, corruption, and institutional invisibility sustain a criminal organization indefinitely? Or does every sophisticated cartel eventually generate enough evidence of its own existence to be destroyed by any sufficiently motivated and resourced state? Cali lasted longer than Medellín, cost more to dismantle, and left deeper institutional damage. It still fell. Does that mean the low-profile model simply buys time? Or does it represent a genuinely different category of threat that law enforcement has never fully solved? Which model do you think was ultimately more dangerous to a state? Escobar's open war or Cali's quiet infiltration? Drop your answer in the comments. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, the subscribe button keeps more of this coming. And if it was worth your time, the like button tells the algorithm someone out here is still interested in how power actually works.